Hey, what's up with it, guys? Welcome back to another video. Now, this is going to be a quick overview of the Dreadstalker legendary. Our neighbors fell down upstairs, it sounds like. Grim Inquisitor's Dread Calling. Now, this legendary, for those of you guys that don't know, for each soul shard that you spend on Hand of Gul'dan, gives you a stacking buff, with each stack granting you 3% bonus damage on your next called Dreadstalkers. Now, this tooltip isn't very explanatory at all. It doesn't have very much information. How long does the buff last? How long does it go up to? Does this apply to Dreadbite? Does it apply to autos? How does this work? So, of course, everyone was interested about this in the poll, and we went ahead and crafted it, and we have done some testing. So I wanted to post this to kind of give you guys my first thoughts on this, use cases, strengths, weaknesses, things like that. Now, first, let's go over the synergies that this item has. Dreadlash is a very good pairing with this legendary. Now, in general, I'm not a huge fan of Dreadlash just by itself. However, one thing that's important to know about this that I actually didn't know or figure out until kind of after playing Demonology for a while, because Demonic Strength is kind of like just the default go-to that everyone likes, is this increases the damage of Dreadlash all the time. So forget the AoE aspect. This increases Dreadlash's damage by 25%. So even in single target, this has a lot of value if you have something like this legendary that's boosting that Dreadlash damage, that Dreadbite damage, your Dreadstalkers in general. This has very, very, very good synergy between them. Now in PvE, Demonic Calling is obviously kind of the go-to here, but in PvP, I really have been liking running Doom, and as you run Master Summoner, making the Dreadstalkers instant cast. That's why I don't run with this in PvP, but in PvP, but in PvE, run Demonic Calling, not Doom. Now, the other thing worth mentioning is From the Shadows has similar pairing with this. Dreadbite's damage itself is Shadow, so it doesn't scale off of this, but everyone's very familiar with the Dreadlash From the Shadows combo for implosion damage and like Mythic Plus type stuff. But for PvP purposes, single target purposes, I had been messing around with Summon Vilefiend. Now, this build that I'm running right here, these talents you see, I have tried a couple BGs, and it was a lot of fun. We actually did some RBGs around 1800 MMR, and we were doing a ton of damage in these RBGs, and I'm going to kind of go over why that is and how this works. Now, Grimoire Felguard, Demonic Consumption, these are pretty straightforward. None of these really scale too much one way or another. You could argue running Soul Conduit to maybe be getting a little bit more shard usage out, stacking this higher, but I think Grimoire Felguard is just too good to pass up for at least for PvP and single target. Now, on to the conduits. So this is going to be a little cut off. I apologize. For those of you guys that don't know, I play on an ultra wide monitor, and some of the stuff I can kind of like trick to like squeeze in, but the conduit page, for some reason, it doesn't let me do that. But an obvious pairing with this legendary is Carnivorous Stalkers, giving your Dreadstalkers a 4.2, depending on what eye level you have this conduit, chance to do an additional Dreadbite. Now, what happens in the way this buff works is it is applied for the entire duration of those Dreadstalkers, and it is extended by your Tyrant. So what this means is, say I was to theoretically get 10 stacks of this debuff up, cast my Dreadstalkers, and then Tyrant those Dreadstalkers. They're going to be buffed by another 15%, and their duration is going to be increased, and they're going to maintain that steroid from this legendary for the entire time. So this isn't going to be our highest performing from a single target perspective, at least I don't think so as of now. However, in PvP, this is actually very, very strong, and it really surprised me a lot. And I'm going to show you guys kind of why that is. But this is my conduit, the go-to with this setup. Oh, one thing I should mention first. In a perfect world, when we start unlocking all these potency conduits, I think this actual setup might be very, very viable when it comes to PvP, paired with the Fel Commando conduit as our second, and having those two set up. Because of the way your Dreadstalkers work and having them on a 20-second cooldown, they're not focused nearly the same as your Felguard is. They're not as visually obvious to your opponents. So being able to maximize their damage is a pretty safe and reliable way to, as far as like accounting on your damage in PvP situations. Felguard's a little bit easier for people to CC, look out for, LOS, all that kind of fun stuff. And a lot of times, at least in higher ratings, people are like trying to kill your Felguard and all that kind of stuff. So having a pairing between those two and relying on both your Dreadstalkers and your Felguard for damage, I think is going to be a very, very strong kind of just overall gameplay style for us when it comes to PvP stuff. Now, let's go over the way that this legendary works. I'll keep my pet here, but you'll see when we cast our first Hand of Gul'dan with this weak ores, if you are using the weak ores that I have from Luxthos, this is already built in where it is already accounting for this buff. So you see this little 3 stack above the Dreadstalkers. That's telling me how many stacks I have. You can also see up here on the top right, Grim Inquisitor's Dreadcalling. We have stacks there as well. One thing worth noting is this buff does not have a duration on it, which is actually very, very, very good. This allows for some pretty interesting, unique ideas that I plan on kind of testing and playing with. But if you think about this, if you're running a setup or a build where you are basically stacking up all this damage on your Dreadstalkers, you can add this into your big burst combo and not be spamming your Dreadstalkers all the time. Granted, Dreadstalkers is a pretty integral part to being able to get demonic core procs and things like that, but if you have situations or setups where you can stack this all the way up, then pair this with things like Vile Fiend, your HP Trinket, your Tyrant, all of this stuff, this allows, I think, probably of all of the legendary setups, your highest burst potential. Now look here, we have 30 stacks of the Dreadstalker buff. This is actually the cap on the stacks, which it doesn't say in the tooltip, but you can see here, I'll cast another Hand of Gul'dan. This is not going to go up past 30. So this caps out at a 90% bonus damage. This is still, though, pretty massive, and I think it would be hard to justify getting like much higher than this. You definitely could do it, but it would either get to the point where it's like ridiculous and you're one-shotting people, or it just would not be efficient. Now, like I said, if you're doing this setup, you're having to generate shards via just Shadow Bolt and having no demonic core procs, which is probably going to be pretty hard most of the time in PvP. However, if you do have situations or setups where you can basically be, forecasting your burst, building this up to where you get 30 stacks and then pairing it with your Grimoire Felguard, Vile Fiend into a Tyrant, having your Dreadstalkers have an additional 15% because of your Tyrant's damage, with this big kind of burst play that you have, and your damage coming from multiple sources, right? People can LOS your Tyrant a lot easier than they can LOS your Dreadstalkers. So I think this is actually going to have a lot of viability as we get a little more familiar and people start playing with this legendary more, because I actually think it's a little bit kind of like sleeper strong, where I didn't really think it was going to be that good because I didn't understand all of these kind of nuance aspects to exactly how it worked. But let me show you here. If we have 30 stacks of this, when I was in PvP, each Dreadbite, because each Dreadstalker is jumping out and they're individually casting their own Dreadbite, right? It crit for like 6k each one. So that's like a 12, assuming both of those crit, that's a 12k burst, instant cast, and it's not that hard to set up. Obviously, getting 30 stacks might not be something you do all the time, but see here, if we cast Dreadstalkers, 2861 non-crit each, right? That's over 5k damage instant cast just from the initial Dreadbite. Now, not to mention if during the uptime of these Dreadstalkers you get a proc from your Conduit, that's another 2500 damage just on the Dreadbite, assuming it's a non-crit. And then you can see the autos of the Dreadstalkers are critting for over 1,000. You extend this with things like Tyrant, stack this with maybe even some like int trinkets or on-use trinkets when you throw them out. It's a very, very strong setup and has a lot of potential. The other thing that's really, really strong with this setup is if you're running this Dreadlash, which I would argue if you're running this legendary, you really probably want to be running Dreadlash 100% of the time just because the synergy is too good. This 8-yard cleave is very, very good in group situations. This is how I was doing a ton of damage. I did one RBG, we did like a Wrathy Basin, and I was doing 30% more damage than anyone else in the BG. And Dreadstalker's Dreadbite was a ton of my damage because in those team fight situations, you can be attacking a healer in the middle and your Dreadbites are just cleaving constantly while you're doing the rest of your rotation with Hand of Gul'dans, with Implosions, with your Tyrant, with your Felguard, all kind of cleave damage, and you're getting a lot of extra free constant AoE pressure via the AoE of Dreadlash when you're running this whole setup. So I highly, highly recommend trying this. It was super, super fun. I low-key think this is probably going to be the legendary I'm going to be wearing in PvP all the time, at least until we get, maybe one of the like Sifus or the other different kind of legendaries. But compared to like Wilfred's, for example, or Horn Nightmare, this seems more impactful and more reliable. The thing about Horn Nightmare that I don't like is it's that 15% chance. So it's real hit or miss with whether you get it or not. And having the consistency of, even if you're only getting, 3 stacks or 6 stacks of this buff out, that's a lot of extra damage over the course of a game. If you look, our Dreadstalkers generally, especially in like arena settings, are a pretty high amount of your DPS if you start playing in higher ratings, where it's not this like mongoloid spam all your buttons as fast as you can and try and kill each other in the first 10 seconds. If you have any kind of longer sustained games, Dreadstalkers ends up being a pretty big part, consistent part of our overall DPS. And so I think this is actually going to be one of our strongest legendaries when it comes to PvP. Now, real quick, let's talk about PvE. I actually did run, I think I kept Grimoire Felguard, but I ran a setup like this, Mythic-wise, and it's actually also very, 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 very good. And to my surprise, this might be one of my go-to legendaries in Mythic Plus as well. And let me tell you the main reason why is because if we're in a pack, for example, say we're killing a pack right here and the mobs are right on the verge of dying, I can basically preemptively set up a massive, massive AoE burst for the next pull. Now, we already can kind of do this, right? If we're playing around Implosion and you basically build up your imps going into the next pull, same idea, but not only now do you have your imp damage, you have your Dreadstalker damage. So you don't necessarily, if that pack's about to die, you know that the cleave from your Dreadstalkers is not going to be really that beneficial. You can kind of just chill, cast your hands, get some imps up, and then you go into the next pack and then see how much. We have 21 stacks here. I go ahead there and then I can do a big implosion and all that's going to cleave everything. We're going to have the From the Shadows debuff for that implosion damage. We're going to have all of that Dreadbite damage in this big, massive burst. It's really great because being able to kind of front load, prepare your burst for the next pack on the pack you're currently killing is very, very big. And that's a very good form of DPS when it comes to Mythic Plus. It's a very useful form of DPS, right? It's not like this useless padding. You're not trying to like fake the meters. It's very effective DPS in a Mythic Plus environment. And so this is actually, I think, going to be a very strong option for us because in general, this From the Shadows Dreadlash setup is just so strong in Mythic Plus for that consistent, reliable AoE DPS. This plays into that whole playstyle with Implosion. The only benefit, I would say that the biggest benefit is you're going to have constant increased damage because of just the AoE of your Dread Bites with this legendary. Not to mention it's also going to give you that option to go into the next pack and basically be pre-planning a huge AoE burst on some of these bigger AoE pulls. Again, using your Tyrant and stacking up a ton of, imps. You can really get creative with this and you can kind of see where it goes, where you have a lot of options and versatility in how you can utilize the DPS from this legendary. All of this was to my surprise. I didn't really think all these things through when I first glanced at this legendary. I didn't realize all the different implications for both single target and for AoE that this legendary has. I am going to post a lot of content here in the next few days. We have the holidays here, but hopefully this weekend of some Mythic Plus stuff, as well as PvP using this legendary. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of clips as of the time of posting this video, so I apologize that we don't have some clips here running in the background. But I wanted to get this out for any of you guys as we go into the Tuesday reset that are considering making this legendary. I'm a huge fan. I actually am very, very pleasantly surprised with how fun this legendary is. The kind of little mini game you have with basically having this big Dreadstalker burst. And it really is catching people off guard in PvP from the little bit of PvP I've done after crafting this. And I'm a big fan and I plan on playing this a lot more, getting more familiar with it. And I'm going to post some arena footage and Mythic Plus stuff using this as well. If any of you guys are curious, that will be coming out soon. So if you're hesitant and don't necessarily want to craft it, that's all fine. Wait for those videos. They will be coming out. But I wanted to get this out there to kind of explain exactly how this legendary works so you guys have a good understanding prior to crafting it of exactly all the nuances and the buffs and stacking and timing and all that kind of stuff. The cap was a big one for me. Figuring out the cap was at 90%. that's good. I mean, I think that that's a realistic cap, but I'm excited to be able to come up with some creative ways of playing that in PvP and hopefully having some big Dreadstalker burst catching people off guard in PvP. We'll see how it goes. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you guys have any questions on this, leave them down in the comments below. I'm sure there's some stuff I probably left out on this, but keep an eye out for those Mythic Plus and PvP videos with this legendary if you are looking at seeing how this plays in real time. Thanks, guys. We'll be streaming a little bit later. Come by, check out the stream. We got Castle Nathria for the next couple evenings, 5 or 6 p.m. Pacific time. So come and hang out, say hi, hit that sub button, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.